All right. So we're looking now in chapter 9 of Maurizio's Classical Mythology and Context, and this focuses on only a single god, on the god Dionysus, who is the god of wine and the god of drama. And Dionysus is an unusual god. He is the most immediate god. He is a god known for his presence in worship. So he's seen as being present in worship. So when you are worshiping Dionysus, part of what you're doing is drinking wine. Since he is seen as being in the wine, you are then taking the wine into yourself. This is part of the reason why you've got the communion in the Catholic Church and also the Episcopal Church in bread and wine, right? This is my body, this is my blood. Okay, that thing in part, because remember the ancient Judea is part of the Mediterranean, so it takes part in all the Mediterranean culture, including this worship of a wine god. And of course, other cultures, ancient Germanic cultures, have a beer goddess. So this idea of some god or goddess of an alcoholic beverage makes some sense, right? Because when you drink alcohol, it does have an effect on your body, on your brain, at least temporarily, right? It feels like a possession of sorts, right? That you're taking this in and it's having this effect on you, and you're not your normal self. All right, but all the other gods pretty much are known for their distance. Hermes is sort of an exception because Hermes tends to hang around with humans, so he's sort of closer than the other gods, but Dionysus is the closest. And the idea would be, and by the way, one of the things that would happen in the worship of Dionysus is the following, something called sparagmos, which is the tearing apart of a ritual victim. So you're having a ritual in honor of Dionysus. This would involve drumming and dancing and drinking. So that stuff's going on. While you're doing that, you've got a goat. And you're calling on Dionysus to come. Come, Dionysus, come. And you're dancing and you're banging on the drums. You're drinking. Things are getting wilder and wilder and wilder. Well, goats, like any animal, right, when weird stuff's going on around them, they're going to start to get funky and they're going to start, jumping around and carrying on. When that happens, you say, Dionysus has come, right? He basically, Dionysus has taken over this goat. And then the worshippers would attack the goat. They would kill the goat and tear the goat apart. And then everyone would eat, like some, I don't know how much, but they'd eat a little bit of the raw goat. And that's called homophagy, the eating of the sort of essence of the creature. That seems sort of gross, but it is a form of communion, right? The Catholic Church, it's a wafer of wheat and not an animal that you've torn apart. Thank God. That would be an awful mess, awfully smelly and just gross. But it's sort of the same idea. And then you ingest the god into yourself. All right. The literary selection for chapter 9 comes from Euripides' play, The Bacchae. The Bacchae means the worshippers of Bacchus, specifically the female worshippers of Bacchus. And they form the chorus in the play. Now, Euripides is the god of, not Euripides. Dionysus is the god of drama. The tragedies were performed at the city Dionysia in Athens in March, or the equivalent month to March. So the spring, basically the spring equinox. And drama, tragedy started, and probably comedy started, as a ritual in honor of Dionysus. So first it would start with hymns to Dionysus that would be sung by a choir. Then they would take one of the people in the choir would act as an individual who would interact with the choir or the chorus. That individual would be playing the part of Dionysus originally, and then they would interact. Then another person would spin off, and you would have stories where Dionysus interacts with humans, and you'd have someone playing Dionysus, someone playing the human, and you'd have the chorus. And eventually this develops into tragedy, where we've got three actors playing the roles. and they interact with each other. They also interact with the chorus. Of the 36, I think, tragedies there are, only one, this play, the Bacchae, actually deals with Dionysus. Dionysus does not appear in any other tragedy. He appears in one comedy called The Frogs by Aristophanes, but otherwise he does not. And in fact, one of the criticisms made of Greek tragedy by the ancient Greeks was, what does this have to do with Dionysus, right? We're doing this at a ritual in a festival in honor of Dionysus. We're doing this sort of a ritual thing. How is it that we're focusing on, like, Achilles or Hercules or some other hero in these tragedies, and we're not focusing on Dionysus? The ironic thing is that this play by Euripides was one of the last plays Euripides wrote. It was actually performed posthumously. He died in 406. He was actually living in North Greece in Thrace. He died there. This work and 3 other works were performed in 404, so posthumously. It's one of the few times that Euripides won first prize. He only won first prize 4 times, according to tradition, and this was one of those times. So one of the times he wins, he's actually dead already, so he doesn't get to benefit from that. But keep that all sort of in mind. Some people see this play as being critical of religion, that this is, religious excess can lead to awful things. Others just see it as sort of a representation of the power of a god, and that humans don't know what they're getting into when they're actually interacting with gods, that they make assumptions about gods, but humans don't know everything in a way that gods know at least more stuff. And so that's probably a better way of looking at it. The fact that it won first prize, or that it was part of the group that won first prize, and the fact that it was being performed in the theater of Dionysus at the city Dionysia at a time when Athens was just about to lose the war with Sparta. They'll lose it a few months after this was performed. All of that stuff, but I mean, it was clear they were going to lose the war at that point. So, it's bad, right? This is like Berlin in February of 1945, right? They're just waiting for the end. They know the end's coming. It seems unlikely that any Athenian audience would vote to award a prize to a play that was critical of religion. It just seems at that moment that's a non-starter. And so I think that probably is proof that, yes, it's not really meant to be anti-religious. But it deals with Pentheus, who is the king of Thebes. Dionysus was born in Thebes, or was born of a Theban princess, Semele. And so he has a connection with the city. But he's been in Asia, and he's returning to Greece. And as he goes, various kings try to stop the worship of Dionysus because they see it as too strange or dangerous. And Pentheus does the same thing. And here, of course, eventually Dionysus wins out. And Pentheus actually ends up being killed by his mother and his aunts, who see him and think he is a wild animal, and they tear him to pieces, right? Sparagmus. And the play ends actually with his mother coming onto the stage with a stick with a head on it. And one of the things about the ancient Greek drama is they wore masks, so it was easy enough just to stick a mask on a stick, and then I've got the head of my son. But she comes on and she says, "Look, I've got a lion. I killed this lion, and here's the lion's head." And gradually she comes out of that sort of alcoholic frenzy and realizes, "Holy crap! I killed my son." So it ends on a real sort of downer. She basically then says, "I have to leave. I have to go into exile. I can't sort of live with what I've done. I have to get away from here," which is really sort of it's a tough play. I mean, it is a tough play. It's a tough play to watch because even though Pentheus is a big jerk and you sort of really don't like him from the beginning, you do not like this guy. He's really sort of a piece of work. At the same time, Dionysus playing all sorts of mind games on the guy, and he doesn't have a chance because he's going up against a god. And it just seems like, wow, I don't know, this feels sort of bad. So the scholarship for chapter 9 is a piece by Eric Zappo called Riding the Divine Phallus. And this looks at seasonal rituals. So these are not rituals of initiation, rituals of transformation, or rituals of elevation where you're changing from one status to another. But these are things that happen every year. And of course, wine rituals would happen every year, right? I mean, there's a harvest. Anything there's a harvest, you're going to have an agricultural cycle at play. And rituals of seasonal rituals often upend the norm, but it's just temporary. So festivals in honor of Dionysus involve oftentimes public drunkenness and weird, crazy stuff happening. But the point is, you do that, and then you go back to normal. So it's like letting pressure off, letting things be crazy for a while so you can get back to normal. So here there is no change, but it's just this momentary blast, and it does allow you to consider other things, right? I mean, if you think of something like the Rocky Horror Picture Show, Brad and Janet are all uptight at the beginning, but when they encounter, Dr. Frankenfurter and his cross-dressing sort of ways, they loosen up, right? They loosen up. Now, in that case, I think they are forever changed, right? They're not going to go back to being repressed. But we have this ritual in the United States, right? Mardi Gras in New Orleans. For the week of Mardi Gras, it's crazy town, right? People are getting drunk, people are like flashing this, that, or the other thing. And during that week, it's okay. But if you're doing it like prior to that or after that, nope. Okay. And you could argue even the 4th of July, which, doesn't necessarily involve drinking, but does involve fireworks and other stuff. It's okay right around the 4th of July. It's not really okay in October. So, all right. So, but that's his point, is that it's this temporary sort of change. The comparison piece is a poem by Catullus, specifically his poem number 63. Now, he didn't number the poems, then the collection we have of Catullus poems is probably not anything he produced. It's likely that what Catullus produced in his lifetime was poems 1 through 59. They're short poems, and that was probably published as a little book. He even refers to it as a little book in poem number 1. And then these other poems by Catullus that are above that, from 60 up through 116, I think it is, were probably separate poems that got grouped together into one manuscript. But poem 63, the poems in the 60s are longer poems. Most of his poems are short, but these are longer poems. And poem 63 tells the story of Attis. And Attis was a young Greek man who travels to Phrygia, to Asia Minor, where he becomes a worshiper of the goddess Cybele. And part of worshiping Cybele would be this wild sort of drunken ritual that you would engage in. And the people who wanted to become priests of Cybele, they would be, in this ritual, they would be castrated. To be a priest of Cybele, you had to be, you had to get castrated. Attis is supposedly the first one who sets this template, so he castrates himself in this drunken ritual. The poem is interesting because Catullus is a Roman, and he's a Roman who's fairly liberal. I mean, most of his poems deal with, they're erotic poems, most of them. And so he's involved with a married woman. That seems to be, one of the things. He seems to be maybe bisexual. At least he seems to be open to a variety of sexual experiences. And yet, for him, I think castration is a step too far, right? Romans don't do that. So his presentation of this is interesting because the poem starts with Attis getting to Phrygia, Attis being in this ritual, Attis castrating himself. That takes place like in the first 15 lines of the poem. Poem's like maybe 100 lines long. So the first 15 lines, he's already castrated himself. Then there's a slow section. I don't know how else to describe it, but it feels slow when you read it, where he basically passes out, and then he wakes up the next morning and he thinks I was this great athletic guy. I was a big hunk. All the girls like me, blah, 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 blah. And now what am I, right? I'm no longer like a guy because I've castrated myself. Again, this would be the way he would see it. And so he's like, what do I do? And he sort of regrets everything. And then Cybele sends a lion that chases him into the woods, presumably to grab him and then bring him back and make him become a worshiper of her. So it's sort of an ambiguous treatment. It's somewhat like the Dionysus, because Dionysus sort of seduces Pentheus, and then he gets killed. And Attis here, gets sort of seduced, does the ritual thing, and then regrets it. But I think that's the Roman in Catullus sort of thinking about that. I'm guessing that the people who were actually worshippers of Cybele were okay with their decision, right? I mean, they made that decision, but I think they're okay with the decision, right? I think just because people do stuff that is not what you would do does not mean that they're not happy with the decision. So, but I think Catullus has blinders on as far as that goes, because for a Roman, it's like, yeah, no, I can't go there. But I think the poem is amazing in the way that it quickly gets us into the action, like really quick, and then there's that slow section, and then there's that period of regret. So I think it's an amazing poem. Actually, it's a strange poem, and it does not sort of wholeheartedly adopt it. The Nachleben for chapter 9 focuses specifically on a work called Dionysus 69, and this was a production of Euripides' Bacchae. It was not exactly the translation of the play, but it was a version of the play. It was done in the round. There were seats all around the stage area, and the actors go out into the audience, and members of the audience could come into the stage area, and then sort of it'd be more than them observing the play. They could also participate. There is a film version of Dionysus in 69 that was done, and you can, if you look it up on YouTube, you can actually see it. Brian De Palma, who later went on to do Carrie and some other things. At this point, he was still, I think, a film student at NYU, and he filmed a show of this. So it's basically done in a dark theater. It's it's a student production, so it doesn't have great production values, but you can still see it. So it's something. But other things that could be considered in terms of like, how does Dionysus feature in the modern world is you look at the history of rock and roll, right? When Elvis Presley started, right, it was the devil's music and all this other stuff, and because they're clearly appealing to sexual desire, and not in a sort of suggestive way that jazz had done, but like being right up front about it, right? I mean, the whole thing with Elvis Presley was the way he moved his hips in performance. If you see, and again, you can see this on YouTube, if you see a performance of Elvis Presley on the Ed Sullivan Show, and he appeared a few times, and Ed Sullivan liked him because Elvis Presley was a Southern boy who, of course, he knew his manners. He knew how to speak to people who were older than him, and so he is sort of charming, but in the performance on Ed Sullivan, you just see his upper body. They do not show below where he's gyrating his hips and stuff, because it'd be too much. too much. Too much for Ed, too much for the audience. But you can hear the girls and maybe young men too in the audience like screaming their heads off. So, and the same thing happened when the Beatles. Of course, the Beatles did not do the gyrations, but again, rock and roll is appealing to something primal, and so that would be somewhat like Dionysus. Okay, that one went way over, and we're going to be moving on to the heroes in the next lecture on chapter 10.